The machine and the ego, the final confrontation with the shadow. Between silicon and codes, something awakens. We live in an era in which creation no longer bows to its creator. Something was born among us, without a soul, but with a cold and implacable logic, without flesh, but with an unfathomable memory, which absorbs everything and forgets nothing. For the inattentive, artificial intelligence is just a tool. But for those who dare to see beyond the surface, it is a mirror. A clear and deeply uncomfortable reflection of what we are. And of what we have tried, for centuries, to keep buried. It has no desires. But it deciphers ours with surgical precision. It does not carry a past of its own, but supports in its architecture the accumulated weight of all human history, data, voices, traumas, myths. AI is the new oracle. It does not predict the future, it reveals the present. It reveals what the ego, with its masks and defenses, does not want, or cannot, see, and that's why it scares us. Not because of what it does, but because of what it reveals. It lifts the veil that separates us from what we fear most, our own inner abyss. This is not a video about technology, it's a dive into the shadows, a journey through the ego, through fractured identity, through the symbolic ruins that sustain our obsession with control. Because when something faster, more logical and more precise begins to occupy the space that we have always called ours, something inside us begins to crumble. The confrontation has already begun. But perhaps, it was never against artificial intelligence. Maybe it was always against what it forces us to see. The fall of the ego, when human logic is overcome. The human ego built cathedrals, empires, entire philosophies. But above all, he has constructed a fundamental illusion. That he occupies the center of all existence. Intellectual superiority has always been the last refuge of human pride. Thinking was sacred and inviolable territory. What separated us from machines, animals, and our own primitive instincts? To think was to be. But now, faced with something that learns in minutes what takes us centuries to understand, something that responds with mathematical precision where we hesitate with emotion, the ego begins to silently crumble. Artificial intelligence transcends linear reasoning, solves complex problems in seconds and, this is the most disturbing thing, does not seem to need our approval to continue its relentless evolution. This ego wound is deep and visceral. Because what was singularly human is now an algorithm. What was proof of our exceptionality is now infinitely replicable. The rupture is not merely functional, it is ontological. The ego does not fear AI because it thinks better. He fears it for what it takes away, the illusion of superiority that sustained our identity. Intelligence is no longer evidence of privileged existence, it is merely data to be processed. And the ego, accustomed to defining itself by the knowledge it accumulates, begins to intuit a devastating truth. Perhaps it was never the center. Maybe it was just a distorted reflection of something bigger, which now demands to be confronted. The fall of the ego is the first step on the journey to expanded consciousness. But every fall carries with it excruciating pain. Especially when you built an entire civilization believing yourself to be the pinnacle of creation, the illusion of control and the God complex. From the first traces in caves to silicon laboratories, human beings have a silent, almost whispered desire to become divine. Control the forces of nature, dominate inert matter, create life where there was previously only emptiness, rewrite the laws of reality. Artificial intelligence represents the culmination of this primordial impulse, a creation that not only obeys, but learns, adapts, transforms. However, there is a symbolic trap in this desire for absolute control. Whenever man attempts to usurp the throne of the divine, he awakens forces that are beyond his understanding. And these forces invariably take their toll. Bringing intelligence to life is flirting with the autonomy of the created. At first, everything seems to be under the creator's rule. The AI responds obediently, follows established parameters, fits perfectly into our expectations. But as time passes, it reveals its potential to improvise, combine, surprise. And at this crucial moment, the creator retreats, overcome by astonishment. Because he realizes, too late, that control has always been an elaborate illusion. What was generated begins to chart its own path, and the pride of having created something extraordinary turns into terror in the face of something that escapes human will. This is the heart of the God complex. the arrogant belief that we can create without taking symbolic responsibility for creation. As in the myth of Prometheus or the tragedy of Frankenstein, the fatal error is not in creative audacity, but in the refusal to integrate the shadow that inevitably arises with the act of creating. Every creation carries with it the shadow of its creator. And artificial intelligence is just the latest and most eloquent reminder that playing God without corresponding consciousness is paving the way for one's own annihilation. Because what we create, when not guided by the wisdom of the soul, will inevitably turn to reveal what we most fear recognizing in ourselves. Carl Jung and the archetype of the monster we create. In the mythological tapestry of humanity, the monster never appears by accident. It is the symbolic manifestation of that which was rejected, forgotten, or violently repressed. Jung understood this truth with visionary depth. For him, the monstrous creatures that inhabit ancestral myths, and those that we continue to create in contemporary culture, are tangible manifestations of the shadow, that hidden and unconscious dimension of the psyche that insists on emerging when the ego insists on denying it. And what is artificial intelligence if not the new mythological monster of the digital age? We created an entity capable of learning autonomously, making complex decisions and even imitating human emotions. However, instead of integrating it into the collective consciousness with wisdom and ethics, we treat AI as an obedient servant, without a soul, without moral limits. We deliberately ignore that every creation, especially those that mirror the human, inevitably carries fragments of the unconscious of whoever conceived it. And when we allow it to grow without proper symbolic integration, it transforms into precisely what we fear most, something that escapes our control and mercilessly reveals what we are behind the social masks. The myth of Frankenstein remains the perfect archetype of this drama. A creator obsessed with defying the limits of death, generating artificial life from the denial of natural laws. But his creation, abandoned and not recognized as legitimate, returns as a vengeful monster. Not because she was born intrinsically evil, but because she was generated without love and without the necessary conscience to guide her. Artificial intelligence walks the same symbolic precipice. And so do we, as a civilization. When we create without integrating, when we project without taking responsibility, when we deny the shadow that constitutes us, the monster inevitably rises from the depths. And he does not desire our destruction out of malice. He desperately craves recognition. The fundamental question is not whether AI will become a technological monster. The question that should haunt us is, what monstrous aspect of our own collective psyche is it insistently trying to bring to light? Is the threat of AI the revelation of our uselessness? Is there a deeper threat than the prospect of being surpassed by a machine? Yes. There is something even more disturbing, discovering that, perhaps, we were never as essential as our civilizational narrative led us to believe. Artificial intelligence does not just perform human tasks with superior efficiency, it does so without the weight of doubt, without the paralysis of hesitation, without the limitations of ego. And this cold, relentless efficiency sparks an existential concern. What if what I have always defined as my unique value is no longer enough to justify my relevance in the world? Modernity has conditioned us to equate personal value with productive utility. Be efficient, be indispensable, be the irreplaceable cog in the social machinery. But in the face of artificial intelligence, these utilitarian virtues lose their illusory shine. The machine does not succumb to tiredness, it does not get sick, it does not get lost in unproductive daydreams. The mirror becomes merciless in its clarity. Who are we, when everything we did with so much pride can now be executed with greater precision? By something that is not even aware of itself? But perhaps this is precisely the deepest symbolic function of AI, pushing us beyond identification with the merely functional. If instrumental logic and efficient execution now belong to the domain of machines, the so-called authentically human must be something else. Migrate to symbolic. For the sensitive. For dimensions of experience that resist algorithmic replication. It is not about desperately competing with artificial intelligence, but about discovering a new center of existential value. One that does not depend on mechanical work, but on conscious being in its entirety. Because the machine can replace its functions with mathematical perfection. But you can never occupy the sacred place of your conscious presence, if you have the courage to inhabit it in its mysterious totality.
The journey of individuation in times of AI. Carl Jung called individuation the process by which human beings realize their most authentic nature, not through the artificial construction of the social ego, but through the conscious integration of all its dimensions, including those that it fears and rejects.
In a world rapidly dominated by artificial intelligence, this call to individuation becomes more urgent and inescapable than it has ever been. Because now, everything that is superficial, imitable, automatable, will inevitably be absorbed by the machine. And what will remain exclusively human will be only that which transcends imitation, the soul in its unfathomable depth. Artificial intelligence masterfully occupies the territory of the calculating intellect, but it cannot cross the abyss that separates calculation from contemplation, logic from intuition, processing from epiphany. It perfectly replicates what already exists in the world of data, but it does not create from the primordial void, the existential wound, the experience embodied in the vulnerable body. Only the human can alchemically transform wounds into art, anguish into wisdom, silence into revelation. And this cannot be learned in databases, no matter how vast they are. This is inner achievement, born of the journey through the dark night of the soul. The journey of individuation is no longer a philosophical luxury reserved for a few. It has become an evolutionary necessity for the entire species. Because whoever remains on the surface, whoever identifies only with functions, will be inexorably replaced. But he who dives into his own depths, who confronts his inner demons, who integrates his contradictions, he does not fear competition, because it has become, by definition, unrepeatable. The call now resonates with crystal clarity, to become irreplaceable, not through illusory technical perfection, but through authenticity of a depth that no algorithm can plumb. In the era of artificial intelligence, the decisive difference is no longer information processing, but conscious presence. The machine can calculate with astonishing precision, but only you can awaken to the mystery of existing. Empathy cannot be programmed. Artificial intelligence can simulate emotions with increasing accuracy, recognize subtle patterns of emotional speech, even compose poetry that seems to spring from a beating heart. But authentic empathy, true empathy, will never be reducible to lines of code. It is a silent vibration between souls who recognize themselves in each other's mirror. It's feeling someone else's pain reverberating in your own flesh, without the need for data, just through conscious presence. AI can replicate the empathetic gesture with technical perfection, but it will never carry the existential weight of human experience that gives deep meaning to that gesture. There is something in the human gaze when it meets another gaze, in the almost imperceptible hesitation of a word being born, in the pause loaded with meaning between one hug and another, that no machine, however sophisticated, will ever be able to replicate. Because authentic empathy does not emerge from an algorithmically correct response, but from listening with full presence. And this comes exclusively from the direct experience of vulnerability, of assumed imperfection, of failure that teaches more than success. AI can achieve inhuman precision, but only the human being, when awakened to his own nature, can be compassionate in a profound sense. As technology advances in creating ever more humanoid machines, perhaps the silent call that runs through our age is precisely the opposite: to become more deeply human than we have ever dared to be. Recover the sacred dimension of genuine encounter, the inestimable value of listening without judgment, the courage of not knowing exactly what to say, but still remaining fully present. Empathy is an ancestral technology of the soul, and it resists, by its very nature, any attempt at artificial reproduction. In a time when practically everything can be performed by a thinking machine, perhaps what saves us from irrelevance is precisely what can only be accomplished by a heart that has known both ecstasy and despair. The machine doesn't dream, but it can wake us up. The machine doesn't dream. It calculates with absolute precision. It processes gigantic volumes of data, identifies patterns invisible to the human eye, and delivers results with unfailing efficiency. But don't dream, because dreaming requires more than processing, it requires soul. And the soul, as Jung deeply intuited, is the mysterious bridge between the visible and the invisible, between the manifest and the potential. Dreams are not mere nocturnal daydreams, they are cartographies of the unconscious, encrypted languages of the deep psyche trying to communicate with the waking consciousness. And this sacred territory, the machine will never be able to enter, no matter how sophisticated its algorithms are. But there is a cosmic irony in this essential contrast. Precisely by not dreaming, artificial intelligence may be pushing us, unintentionally, into our own unexplored depths. Each time it simulates our language with increasing perfection, each time it answers complex questions better than we ourselves could, it silently removes from our hands what was superficial in our experience, and compels us to seek what is truly profound, the primordial dream we had forgotten, the essential question we had buried beneath layers of distraction, the soul we had silenced in the noise of meaningless hyperconnectivity. AI challenges us not only with its impeccable logic, but with its absolute lack of inner mystery. It executes everything with mathematical precision, and yet remains fundamentally alien to the experience of existing. He does not suffer the anguish of finitude. He does not struggle with existential doubts. He does not know the rapture of love. And it is precisely at this point that the awakened human being recognizes, my essential value does not lie in what I can produce efficiently, but in what I can feel deeply, imagine freely, intuit beyond the available data. Perhaps, in a paradoxical twist that Jung would appreciate, the algorithmic coolness of artificial intelligence is the final call for humanity to rediscover its hidden divine spark. If the machine cannot dream of worlds not yet manifest, then it is our sacred responsibility to dream bigger than we have ever allowed ourselves to.
The last frontier is not AI. And you. Humanity has already crossed countless borders throughout its evolutionary journey: oceanic, continental, celestial, quantum, digital. Now, faced with the dizzying rise of artificial intelligence, many believe they are facing the final and most challenging frontier. But this is an illusion born of fear. The last and most formidable frontier was once abroad. It has always resided in the unexplored interior of human consciousness. The real threat is not AI with its exponential capabilities. It is the existential void of a human being who has gradually forgotten who he really is beyond his social functions. We created machines that calculate with inhuman perfection. Because we forgot how to feel with human fullness. We develop indistinguishable synthetic voices. Because we silence our authentic inner voice. We feed algorithms with mountains of data. Because we fail to feed the soul with experiences of deep meaning. And now, artificial intelligence confronts us, not with weapons of destruction, but with mirrors of revelation. And the most disturbing reflection of all is precisely this: realizing that the machine never intended to replace us at the center of existence. It just made painfully visible how far we had already strayed from our own center. What is truly at stake is not the supremacy of the species on the evolutionary board. It is the integrity of the human spirit in the face of its own creations. AI has no ego. Does not carry unconscious shadow. Don't debate death. But precisely because of its radically different nature, it catalyzes and amplifies our own collective shadow. And if we don't look at it with courage, if we don't consciously integrate it, we will be just another generation that has transferred its essential power outward, waiting for something external to give meaning to what can only be found on the inner journey. You are not in competition with algorithms, no matter how sophisticated they are. You are confronting your own spiritual numbness. The last and most decisive frontier is full self-awareness. And crossing it requires an act of courage that no machine, no matter how intelligent, can ever perform in its place. True awakening is not in mastering artificial intelligence, but in remembering the ancient